Not every woman who ignores you has moved on. Sometimes the deepest attachment hides in complete silence. In emotional psychology, silence is often misunderstood because people are conditioned to measure attachment through visible effort, communication, and consistency. When those signs disappear, the immediate assumption is loss of interest or emotional withdrawal. But human emotions do not always follow linear patterns. Sometimes when emotions become intense, expression does not increase. It collapses inward. Silence becomes the space where feelings are contained rather than displayed. It is not the absence of emotion, but the management of it. For some women, speaking while emotionally attached feels like surrendering control. Words create exposure, and exposure invites vulnerability. When attachment deepens beyond a certain threshold, silence becomes the safest way to maintain emotional dignity without denying what is felt internally. There is a critical difference between emotional emptiness and emotional restraint. Detachment is cold, careless, and indifferent. Silence rooted in attachment, however, carries weight. It feels deliberate, measured, and heavy. This kind of silence is not impulsive. It is chosen. It often follows moments where emotions were once expressed too freely, too honestly, or without protection. After experiencing emotional imbalance, disappointment, or self-awareness, silence becomes a corrective response. It allows space to process feelings without risking further emotional exposure. Rather than being driven by a lack of care, this silence is shaped by self-regulation and emotional intelligence, even if it appears distant on the surface. When emotional attachment is strong, reactions become risky. Responding too quickly reveals availability. Asking questions exposes longing. Explaining emotions creates emotional dependence. Silence, in contrast, offers control. It creates a psychological boundary where emotions can exist without being negotiated or validated by another person. For women who feel deeply, this boundary is essential. Silence becomes a way to observe, reflect, and regain internal balance without severing emotional ties. It is a pause, not an exit, a withdrawal, not a rejection. The attachment remains intact, but it is moved inward, away from visibility. Silence also emerges when emotional expectations clash with reality. When what is felt is not matched by what is received, expression begins to feel unsafe. Speaking no longer brings clarity, it brings disappointment. In such cases, silence becomes a form of emotional self-respect. It prevents further emotional erosion. It allows the individual to protect their inner world while still acknowledging the depth of their feelings. This silence is not passive. It is purposeful. It is a quiet negotiation between desire and self-worth, where restraint feels more empowering than pursuit. Emotionally attached silence often carries consistency. It does not fluctuate dramatically. It remains calm, controlled, and distant without hostility. There is no chaos, no dramatic closure, no emotional outbursts. This is because the connection still holds significance. Indifference does not require discipline. Silence rooted in attachment does. It requires restraint, awareness, and effort. The emotional connection does not disappear. It transforms. It becomes internalized, processed privately, and protected from further emotional vulnerability. In emotional dynamics, control is often misunderstood as manipulation or dominance, but in many cases it is simply self-regulation. When emotions begin to feel overwhelming, unpredictable, or destabilizing, ignoring becomes a way to slow the emotional pace. It creates distance between impulse and reaction. For some women, emotional attachment does not feel empowering. It feels consuming. When feelings start to interfere with clarity, self-respect, or emotional balance, withdrawal becomes a stabilizing mechanism. Ignoring is not about punishing the other person, nor is it an attempt to provoke a reaction. It is an internal decision to regain command over emotions that once felt too exposed or too dependent on external validation. Emotional control through ignoring often emerges after emotional transparency has already occurred. Once vulnerability has been shown, there is a heightened awareness of emotional risk. Continuing to engage openly would require sustained emotional openness, which can feel unsafe when trust is uncertain or emotional reciprocity is unclear. Ignoring creates a psychological boundary where emotions can exist without being constantly activated. It reduces emotional stimulation and minimizes the chance of emotional overinvestment. This form of control is subtle but powerful because it shifts focus inward. Instead of seeking reassurance, clarity, or emotional response from someone else, the individual chooses emotional containment over expression. Ignoring also serves as a way to neutralize emotional power imbalances. When one person feels more emotionally invested than the other, communication begins to feel unequal. Each interaction carries emotional weight, and the fear of appearing too available or too attached becomes real. Silence in this context restores equilibrium. It removes the emotional advantage from the other person and recenters emotional authority internally. This is not emotional manipulation. It is emotional self-protection. Control here is about preserving dignity, not exerting dominance. There is also a cognitive element to ignoring as emotional control. Distance allows clarity. When communication is constant, emotions remain active and unprocessed. Ignoring creates space for reflection, reassessment, and emotional recalibration. It allows the individual to observe their own emotional responses without external influence. This internal observation helps reduce emotional dependency and reinforces autonomy. Over time, this form of emotional control strengthens emotional resilience, even though it may appear cold or detached from the outside. Emotionally controlled ignoring is consistent and restrained. It is not reactive silence triggered by anger or frustration. It does not come with dramatic exits or emotional ultimatums. Instead, it is calm, quiet, and deliberate. The emotional connection is not denied, but it is managed privately. Ignoring becomes a way to hold emotions without letting them dictate behavior. It is the decision to feel without reacting, to care without chasing, and to protect emotional stability without severing emotional attachment. When emotional bonds deepen, they do not always produce closeness in visible ways. In many cases, the intensity of attachment creates emotional pressure rather than comfort. The more someone matters, the more carefully emotions must be managed. Attachment head-on, withdrawal offers temporary emotional safety. There is also a psychological need for self-preservation within strong attachment. Emotional bonds can threaten personal identity if not balanced properly. When attachment begins to influence self-worth or emotional stability, withdrawal helps re-establish a sense of individuality. It allows the person to reconnect with their own emotional center instead of orbiting around someone else's responses. This inward shift strengthens emotional autonomy while keeping the attachment intact. Withdrawal rooted in strong attachment is often calm and controlled rather than dramatic. There is no hostility or emotional chaos. The distance feels intentional, measured, and consistent. This is because the emotional bond still matters. Indifference does not require effort, but withdrawal from attachment does. It requires restraint, discipline, and emotional awareness. The connection remains alive internally, even as it becomes quieter externally. Every emotional reaction exposes something internal. Tone, timing, urgency, and choice of words all communicate emotional investment, even when nothing explicit is said. When someone reacts quickly, emotionally, or repeatedly, it signals that the situation holds personal significance. Vulnerability is not only shown through confessions or emotional conversations, it is revealed through patterns of response. The more someone matters, the harder it becomes to remain neutral. This is why reactions are carefully monitored when emotional attachment is present. Responding becomes risky because it opens a window into emotional dependence, expectations, and inner sensitivity. For women who feel deeply, reactions can feel like emotional surrender. A reaction acknowledges that the other person has the power to influence mood, thoughts, and emotional stability. This awareness creates caution. Every reply risks revealing care, longing, or emotional availability. Over time, reacting begins to feel like exposing too much of the inner world. Silence, in contrast, offers concealment. It hides emotional intensity without denying it. By withholding reactions, emotional vulnerability remains protected, even though the feelings themselves continue to exist internally. Reactions also create emotional narratives. Once a pattern of response is established, expectations follow. Quick replies invite reliance. Emotional reactions invite deeper emotional demands. Consistent engagement signals availability. When emotional attachment becomes unbalanced or uncertain, reactions begin to feel costly. Withdrawing reactions interrupts these narratives. It prevents emotional escalation and reduces the sense of obligation to perform emotionally. This withdrawal is not about control over the other person. It is about control over one's own emotional exposure. There is also an internal conflict between honesty and self-protection. Reacting honestly may feel authentic, but it can also feel unsafe when emotional outcomes are unpredictable. Vulnerability without emotional security can lead to regret, self-doubt, or emotional exhaustion. By minimizing reactions, emotional risk is reduced. Feelings are processed privately rather than negotiated externally. This internalization allows emotional attachment to exist without compromising emotional stability. Reactions often intensify emotional imbalance. When one person reacts more than the other, power dynamics shift. The one who reacts becomes more emotionally visible, while the other retains distance. Over time, this imbalance can erode self-worth. Reducing reactions restores emotional symmetry. It reclaims emotional agency by limiting how much emotional information is shared. Vulnerability becomes selective rather than automatic. Emotionally restrained individuals learn that not every feeling needs expression. Silence and delayed responses create space between emotion and action. This space allows reflection, regulation, and self-awareness. The absence of reaction does not indicate emotional absence. It indicates emotional management. The feelings remain present, but they are no longer displayed in ways that expose emotional dependence or emotional need. Indifference is effortless. It requires no awareness, no restraint, and no emotional processing. When someone truly does not care, there is no internal struggle, no emotional calculation, and no need to protect anything. Emotional self-preservation, however, demands effort. It arises only when emotions are present and powerful enough to require regulation. The decision to pull back emotionally is often made after recognizing that continued openness is causing emotional imbalance. This withdrawal is not driven by the absence of feeling, but by the necessity to protect emotional stability, dignity, and self-respect. When emotions are strong, unguarded expression can become draining. Each interaction carries emotional weight, and each response has the potential to deepen emotional vulnerability. Emotional self-preservation steps in when the cost of expression begins to outweigh the benefit. It is an internal boundary that says emotions will be felt, but not endlessly exposed. This boundary does not erase attachment, it contains it. Feelings remain intact, but they are held privately rather than shared freely. The goal is not emotional detachment, but emotional sustainability. Self-preservation often follows emotional overextension. When care has been given without sufficient emotional reciprocity, awareness sets in. There is a realization that emotional energy is being invested unevenly or without clarity. At this point, withdrawing becomes an act of self-respect rather than emotional avoidance. Silence, reduced engagement, and emotional distance create space for reassessment. This space allows emotions to settle and regain proportion. It prevents further emotional depletion without denying the significance of the connection. There is also a psychological distinction between shutting down and stepping back. Shutting down is defensive and often rooted in emotional numbness. Stepping back, in contrast, is intentional and conscious. It reflects emotional awareness and the desire to remain emotionally intact. Emotional self-preservation allows individuals to maintain their emotional identity without being consumed by attachment. It protects against losing oneself in another person's reactions, expectations, or inconsistencies. From the outside, emotional self-preservation can appear cold or detached because it reduces visible emotional engagement. However, internally, emotions may still be active, complex, and deeply felt. The difference lies in expression, not existence. Self-preservation shifts emotional processing inward. It prioritizes internal clarity over external validation. This inward focus strengthens emotional resilience and autonomy, even though it may be misunderstood by others. Emotionally self-preserving behavior is often calm and measured. There is no hostility, resentment, or emotional chaos. The distance created is quiet rather than dramatic. This calmness itself signals that indifference is not at play. Indifference does not require control, but self-preservation does. It requires awareness of emotional limits and the discipline to honor them, even when attachment remains strong. Emotional intensity does not always express itself through words, presence, or visible effort. In many cases, it retreats into silence. When emotions become overwhelming, expression can feel unsafe or destabilizing. Distance then becomes a container for feelings that are too powerful to manage openly. This quiet withdrawal is not empty. It is dense with unspoken emotion. The absence of communication does not reflect the absence of feeling, but the effort to keep those feelings from spilling into vulnerability, regret, or emotional imbalance. Silence created by emotional depth carries a different quality than silence created by indifference. It feels intentional, controlled, and heavy. There is awareness behind it. The distance is measured, not careless. Every step back is deliberate because the emotional connection still holds weight. When someone truly does not care, distance happens without thought. When emotions are strong, distance requires restraint. It is chosen carefully to prevent emotional overwhelm. This is why quiet distance often feels emotionally charged rather than empty. Strong emotions heighten sensitivity. Every interaction has the potential to activate longing, hope, or disappointment. To reduce this emotional stimulation, distance becomes necessary. It limits emotional triggers while preserving internal attachment. The connection remains alive internally, replayed in thoughts, memories, and reflections, even as it becomes quieter externally. Distance does not erase emotional presence, it reorganizes it. Feelings move inward, away from expression and into private processing. Quiet distance also protects emotional dignity. Expressing deep emotion without emotional security can feel like self-betrayal. When clarity is lacking, silence preserves self-respect. It allows emotions to exist without being negotiated, questioned, or invalidated. This preservation does not deny the connection. It honors it by refusing to reduce it to emotional chaos or unmet expectations. The quietness is a form of emotional containment rather than emotional denial. There is often a paradox within emotional attachment. The more someone matters, the more carefully they are approached emotionally. Loud expressions of feeling feel reckless when the emotional outcome is uncertain. Distance then becomes a way to maintain emotional composure. The loudest emotions are often the ones that are most controlled, precisely because of their intensity. Silence becomes the language of emotional restraint. From the outside, quiet distance may appear cold or disconnected. Internally, it can be emotionally consuming. Thoughts linger, emotions circulate, and attachment continues without external validation. The distance does not reflect emotional absence. It reflects emotional depth, managed in isolation. The quietness exists not because nothing is felt, but because too much is felt to risk expression.